At what point did you realize that this fire may potentially result in multiple victims?
Pretty early on, when I first heard about the fire and how fast it was moving and how big it was, I thought, well, we might have to assist Butte County in some way. I never thought it would be to the magnitude that it was. That was horrible. But I did think pretty early on that we were going to have to help.
Tell me about what you were thinking when you were driving there. I mean, what was kind of going through your mind? How do you prepare yourself for the job that you do?
It was so dark. I mean, it looked like almost like nighttime, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was so hard to breathe. And in some areas, you would just have ash coming down. It looked like it was snowing. So it was horrible, and we weren't even very close. We were on kind of the outskirts of where this had happened. I didn't hear about the first victims through the media. I heard from Cal OES that said that they had a few victims, and and Butte was asking for our assistance.
In that assistance, what would you be doing with those victims that they weren't capable of doing?
Well, our facility is pretty big, and we can actually handle a lot more people than Butte County, because they don't have a morgue. They didn't have a large refrigeration system like we do. They typically run their exams at that time at mortuaries. So we do have a big storage facility here. We also have a big 53-foot refrigerated truck that we keep off site that we had moved over for this. We can handle a lot more exams because our place is pretty big, and that's what they asked us to do. We already had some contact with them, helping them with autopsies over the years when their doctor was on vacation or needed some help with a particular case. So we had that relationship with them already, so it was just natural for us to take over that portion for them and assist them. And they had their hands full with everything else that they were doing. So we just took over the identification and examination portion, the scientific portion.
Up until the campfire, what is the largest mass casualty event that you've handled in the past in your career, 20-year career here?
5.
5. So you go from handling 5 to 85. How do you handle something like that?
Well, first you have a little anxiety spell, because just the first day is going to be more than you've ever handled. And then we just handle it like we always have. The number is not really of consequence. It's how we take care of each person that comes through here. So I came in on Saturday, got my staff together, we organized. In mass fatalities, you have to do them a little bit different, where each victim has to go through a station so that we can do the same thing for every victim. We set up stations. We started the process of admission for each victim, and then moved them on to autopsy, which is important that gets done. And then what other specialists do they need to make the identification? It may be that we do fingerprints and that's it. They're done, they're identified, and then all they need is an exam. With fire victims, very few can actually be identified by fingerprints. We only had 5 that we identified by fingerprints.
What were the conditions of the victims that you were seeing coming in here, and how did that pose as a challenge to identifying them and figuring out the cause and manner of death?
Well, a couple of the victims were okay to do, the first set were okay to do the fingerprint identification. So we were pretty hopeful that maybe we would get more victims that we could ID by fingerprints and get the families notified much quicker. That turned out to not be the case. Most of the victims were very badly burnt. In some cases we just had some bones, that was it. And so that creates a challenge in that, we've got to probably turn to DNA on these identifications. And typically, DNA has taken a long time, which is very hard for the families. I mean, they know that their loved one is missing. We need to get them an answer. And we have to tell them, well, you have to wait because the DNA process takes so long. And we were very lucky that that changed in this incident.
Before we get to that change, how often have you had to utilize DNA to identify victims in the past, just here in Sacramento?
We probably send about 10 or so cases to Department of Justice every year, and it does take 4 to 5 months generally to get a response on the ID. That's pretty normal, just because of the intense amount of time it takes for the testing. So that's about 10 a year, I think, is pretty normal. We try everything else. We try, and we did do some identifications through dentals. We had about 15 that were done through dentals.
So you had 10, you on average about 10 DNA cases a year in a normal year. How many DNA cases were used in the campfire?
It's probably going to end up being close to 60 of the IDs were made through Rapid DNA.
So how quickly were victims being identified? I mean, did it become quicker when Rapid DNA started being utilized, or when did that start? When did the identification start to roll in?
I was staying here until really late at night, so I don't remember exactly what day it was when they did the first ID. I just remember who it was, and that I was amazed because we hadn't had any contact with Rapid DNA. It had all been in the lab, and I remember thinking that this horrible thing might be the first time that this technology has been used, and that these families might get closure way faster than we would ever imagine.
Speaking of the long hours that you were working, how were you coping with all of this as it was happening?
I think that, when it happens, you think that you're going to be focusing on all the bad things, and it really becomes, for our staff, we're programmed a little bit differently, where we actually are striving to get certain answers, where we want to get a cause and manner. That wasn't really as important in this one, but the identifications were so important. And I think that first identification that we did with the DNA just kind of galvanized us to, as fast as we could, get these samples to ANDE and get this going so we could help Butte County with notifying these families. They did all the notifications. We would just send them the information. So it was kind of a blur. I wouldn't know what time it was. We were just here. Our staff were here. We were working, almost 24/7 on this, and we had help from other counties that were sending their staff over to work in our morgue with us. This is a specialized job. You can't just send anybody. So other coroners' offices were actually, and medical examiner offices were sending their staff over to help us.
Are there any cases in particular that stick with you? I know you're so removed, you're almost looking like this as a scientific act, but are there any cases that stick with you in particular?
I think they all do. I don't think that anyone was any more present in my mind than any other. I mean, some of the victims have gotten more press, so naturally I'm going to think of them first. But overall, if I didn't have that, we kind of memorized everything about these 84 victims that we got, because we only got 84. We would keep this sheet of kind of a communication style between, because we had so many people visiting and they didn't know our case management system. So we were doing pen and paper, and we had these large papers that we hung on the wall that's been talked about a little bit, and you could just walk through and you could tell me the case number and I could tell you who they probably were. And So they were all just very important to us.
When you finally got one victim identified, the next victim, what would be the feeling knowing that someone was identified, that you finally had a name, to those remains?
Well, I can tell you what we did. We had the papers that I just talked to you about. They were these large easel-style papers that you could stick. So they were stuck on the walls of this hallway. When someone came in, we would, as part of the admitting process, we would write up this large easel paper, what we knew of them. And then once the pathologist did the exam, they would come in this hallway and they would write what they found. And then that paper would be moved into one of our big conference rooms that we actually made into an office, like a big office for identification. And we had it set up where one wall was identification made and the rest of the walls were, whatever we were doing. So if we were waiting on DNA, it would be on that wall. If we were waiting for dentals, it would be on that wall. And we would move the paper to the identification wall, and whoever was in the office would come in there and they would watch us, whoever was moving it to the identification wall. And it was just very silent and pretty moving.
What kind of person do you have to be? What kind of control do you have to see what you see?
Well, I get asked that question a lot. There's not any one particular kind of person, I think, that can do this job. The first thing is they need to be able to handle a lot of sadness, and the person needs to be able to handle, what they see. It's not always pleasant. It's most of the time not pleasant. So they need to have those two things. But most importantly, I think that they need to be able to be empathetic and to focus on what is our mission. Our mission is to, determine cause and manner and to bring swift closure to families when we can. So that if they focus on their mission and look at it that way, they'll do fine here. Some people can't handle it. They think they can, and they come in and they work and they realize that it's not for them.
What do you think you've learned from this terrible, terrible situation that unfortunately, hopefully you'll never have to use again, but are there lessons that were learned?
Yeah, there were a lot of lessons that were learned. I thought we were very prepared, and we weren't. I think that we need more training, not just within our agency. I think that we need training across the agencies. Not a lot of attention is paid to mass fatality incidents. And I think that we need to focus on that and what we can do as death investigation agencies, no matter what we call ourselves, what we can do to support each other and train with each other and make sure that we're there to help if this happens again. That's the biggest lesson for me. And I also think from this particular incident, I don't think that we can go back to using regular DNA processes. I think we need to move forward and make sure that rapid DNA is ingrained into whatever training we have, and we have that ability to use it. I mean, we owe it to whatever victims in the future to make sure we don't go backwards but go forwards.